Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus is one of the best known of the Byzantine emperors, and also one of the most interesting, largely due to the twin facts that he wrote quite a bit, and that his career had some pretty incredible ups and downs. He also saw quite a bit of variation in his life, which is pretty ironic given that his name Porphyrogenitus implies that he was born in the purple and should have had a pretty easy path to power. Yet that's not how things worked out for Constantine. He was, for much of his life, a political prisoner. I think that played a big role in allowing him to become a scholar. And later in life, he finally got to actually exercise the power of the throne that he had held for so long. He only really served as emperor for about 14 years. And what we'll do in this video is look at all of the various periods of his career and then look at what he accomplished both as a scholar and as a ruler of the Byzantine world. Let's review Constantine's family history. He was a scion of the Macedonian dynasty. By his time, this dynasty had been established for quite a while. His grandfather Basil I the Macedonian had founded the line back in the 860s, so by the time that Constantine VII was born in 905, his family was quite popular in the Byzantine world. His father was Leo VI the Wise, and he was at the height of his power when Constantine was finally born. His mother was Zoe Carbonopsina, the fourth and final wife of Leo VI, a woman who was known for having exceptionally beautiful eyes. He also had an uncle named Alexander, who was probably an alcoholic, and Alexander would serve as emperor for about a year when Constantine was just a boy. So those would have been the major figures in his early childhood. In the case of Basil, he was long dead, but still his influence would have reached and inspired Constantine's life. The story of Constantine's political struggles actually dates back to before his own birth. The main struggle of Leo VI's reign, as we discussed weeks ago, is that he struggled to produce a male heir with his first three wives. Under the norms of the Orthodox Church, it was not yet a law. A man was only permitted to have up to three wives, and even that third wife was kind of pushing it. For Leo, as someone who needed an heir to avoid having his dynasty end and the empire fall into some kind of civil war, this was an imperative act. And it was made more imperative by the fact that his brother Alexander was also childless. So Leo thought that it was best to go against what the majority of the church thought, and he took up a mistress named Zoe Carbonopsina, and when she finally gave birth to a son that they named Constantine in 905, Leo then had to engage in a long and grueling battle with the church in order to make sure that Constantine could be baptized and then recognized, adopted, and crowned. That was all a pretty exacting battle, and it left a lot of hurt feelings. Now, there was no indication that Leo was going to drop dead in 912, and had he lived longer, he was popular and powerful, and it's pretty likely that he would have been able to smooth over all of those hurt feelings and make things easy for Constantine. After all, Constantine earned the nickname of Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple, which would imply that he was legitimate from the outset, but it's actually somewhat ironic since there were people throughout his life who challenged the legitimacy of his birth, and even when he was well established and had been emperor for years, there was a patriarch as late as 956 who would throw this in his face once again. So this is something that's going to haunt him forever, and it plays a huge role in why Constantine was really unable to take control of the empire early on. In 912, as I mentioned, Constantine's father Leo passed away. From that point up until 945, there would always be someone with either a knife to his throat or, as we'll see, with a knife to his ballsack. Constantine's uncle Alexander took over as emperor in 912, and one of his first acts was to banish Constantine's mother Zoe Carbonopsina from the court. This left the young Constantine bereft of parental influence, and we have to imagine that this may have played a role in driving Constantine to become more bookish. Alexander at this time was childless. He was already in his 40s, had a major drinking problem, and this meant that his only possible heir was his nephew Constantine. So in theory, Constantine's life should have been pretty much safe. However, Alexander seems to have contemplated having Alexander castrated and apparently discussed this with his ministers. They thought the idea was horrific, so they managed to dissuade him from doing it. Of course, at this time, Alexander was supposedly praying to the gods in the Forum to bless his genitals and make them function again, or I guess they'd be the gods in the Hippodrome. That didn't work, and then he passed away the next year. When Alexander died in 913, Zoe was able to come back to court and set up a council of regency for Constantine. He was slated to come of age in the year 920, so he could look forward to about 7 years of his mother's tutelage, and then he would take over the responsibilities of the throne. Or at least that was the plan. Unfortunately for Constantine, his mother's regency did not end up extending until he achieved the age of 15 in 920. And for the 6 years that she served as regent, Zoe presided over a shaky court and an empire that was in trouble. At home, she had some enemies. Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus was still upset about what Leo had pulled off, and he was determined to redress what he saw as the wrong of having an emperor force his will on the church. He still was not entirely convinced that Constantine should be emperor or that his birth was in any way legitimate. So he was someone they would have to watch out for. They also had ambitious noblemen who were looking to become more influential at court and take advantage of what was going on, the rule of a woman and a sickly boy with questionable legitimacy. I didn't mention it earlier, but I have mentioned it before. While he was young, Constantine was on the sickly side, and there were rumors that he would pass away before he attained his majority. So if you were an ambitious nobleman, you were looking hungrily at the imperial court. More important than all of that, however, was the pressure that was mounting on Zoe due to the threat of Simeon of Bulgaria. Simeon and the Bulgarians were pressing hard against the Byzantine world, and what this did was really call into question her leadership as Byzantine forces suffered setback after setback. There were ambitious commanders who, despite their own failures against the Bulgarians, tried to paint themselves as potential saviors from this situation. By 919, Leo Phocas, one of the leading generals of the empire, and Romanus Lecapenus, the admiral-in-chief, were competing for control of the palace. In 919, the conflict between Romanus and Leo Phocas came to a head. That year, Romanus managed to seize control of the palace, and later on, when Leo tried to raise an army against him, Romanus's followers eliminated him. Now Romanus was the effective power at court, despite the fact that the Empress Zoe Carbonopsina was not a big fan of the peasant-born Romanus. Constantine ended up marrying Romanus's daughter Helena within a short period of time, at the insistence of, you guessed it, Romanus Lecapenus. He then was forced to name his father-in-law as both Basilioperator and as Caesar. This was something of a precedent from the time of Leo the Wise, when he had named as Basilioperator his own father-in-law, but there had been a much different power dynamic between Leo and his father-in-law, as opposed to that between Romanus and Constantine. Constantine was very much Romanus's puppet and political prisoner. Just prior to his 15th birthday, Constantine was compelled to name Romanus as his imperial colleague. While in theory Constantine remained the senior emperor, in practice Romanus was now governing the Byzantine world, and he would continue to do so until December of 944. Just a couple of months before Constantine was forced to crown his father-in-law as his equal, he also had to help preside over a church council which passed the Tomus Unionis. Romanus and Nicholas Mysticus had combined forces to set up new church rules. Romanus was looking to ingratiate himself with Nicholas Mysticus, while also undermining the prestige of his son-in-law. For Romanus, this was a pretty shrewd move. For Nicholas Mysticus, this accomplished a theological objective. The only thing that Constantine got out of this is that he was finally able to allay the anger of Nicholas Mysticus, who eventually agreed to just let him be. However, to view this as anything other than a defeat for Constantine is very difficult to justify. During this council, they passed the Tomus Unionis. This set down a firm rule that no man was permitted to have more than 3 marriages, and that any children from an additional union were not legitimate. Constantine VII was granted a special exemption from this, presumably on the grounds that he had been born before this ruling, but this document still served to discredit his rule indirectly, and it also enhanced Romanus's prestige by proxy. Romanus, of course, came from a perfectly legitimate marriage. His father had risen in power under Basil I, and he could also now hold something over his son-in-law. He had granted his son-in-law his continued power, at least in theory, and his residence in the palace, so he could argue in a way that Constantine was in his debt, that he had saved Constantine from the wrath of the church. Of course, Constantine was a very intelligent young man, so he would know that that was complete nonsense, but nonetheless, Romanus would probably lord this over him. Shortly after this, Zoe, who was no doubt angry, was banished from the court. Romanus accused her of plotting against him and sent her off to a convent. Most likely what happened is that Zoe was furious and vented her frustration at Romanus, and he decided to just get rid of her. After all, she had engaged in a union that was now illegal, and what reason was there for her to be at court? Her son was almost an adult, and there was another emperor around, so there wasn't really much need for her services as a part of the government, and she could go and attend to her religious duties. By 920, Constantine had suffered great indignity, and he would continue to take hits over the next several years, as Romanus continued to consolidate his own power and to diminish Constantine's. While Constantine remained the senior emperor, Romanus's image took over on the coinage. There were supposedly rumors that this move was supposed to accustom people to the idea of Romanus being the only emperor, and many people expected that soon it would be announced that the sickly Constantine had simply perished, and that he had given his blessing to Romanus's reign. But of course that didn't happen. Romanus decided that Constantine was a useful political puppet, and that his continued survival would indicate to the people that the Macedonian dynasty lived on, and Romanus was more or less just its guardian. This was important for really establishing his own political authority and that of his family. And also to really enhance the standing of his family, Romanus decided to crown his thrones alongside of himself and Constantine. In 921, Romanus's oldest, most able, and favorite son, Christopher, was associated with the throne. In 924, Romanus decided to add Stephen and Constantine Lecapenus to the imperial suite. And now there were 5 emperors, at least until 931 when Christopher died. What this meant was that Constantine's power was diminished just by the multiplication of the number of men who could claim to be emperor. Constantine was now just one among many. He wasn't even competing with the throne with just one Lecapenus, but with 4 of them. He still performed some ceremonial functions, but for the most part it seems that he more or less was forced to stay out of politics. Romanus I was the person making all of the real decisions in Byzantium at this time. However, so far as I understand it, it was understood from an early time that at least in theory Constantine would be the successor when Romanus died. I think in practice, though, everyone expected that when push came to shove, Romanus would announce that one of his sons was taking over rather than Constantine. Of course, the premature death of Christopher also complicated that, since Romanus's other two sons, Stephen and Constantine, would prove to be quite a bit less capable than Christopher had been. I think that it's now worth considering what Constantine was like as a person and how he spent his time, since he clearly was not allowed to actively participate in government beyond the ceremonial roles that he would have to play from time to time. It appears that despite Constantine's terrible situation, that he and his wife Helena seem to have enjoyed a relatively happy marriage, producing two sons, Leo and Romanus, as well as 5 daughters. Leo would die young, that was something of a tragedy, but Romanus would grow to manhood. Constantine was tall, he had a dark black beard, and he was more or less overweight. They didn't have the word overweight back then, but I think that's what we'd call someone like him today. By all accounts, he ate and drank too much, but unlike a lot of people who like to hit the wine, he was always respectful and courteous, and was never mean or rude to anyone at court. I guess that's fitting, since he literally wrote the book on court ritual. He was a talented painter. We don't have any of his surviving works, but by all accounts he was very good at it, and he had many interests and hobbies besides. However, the thing that he's most known for, and the thing that he really devoted himself to, was scholarship. Constantine was a bibliophile, and he also aspired to write great works which would classify and categorize large fields of knowledge, especially knowledge which was pertinent to the running of the Byzantine state. Just to add a little bit of context, Constantine's reign fell in the middle of the Macedonian Renaissance. This is the period between 867 and 1056, which is exactly coterminous with the Macedonian dynasty itself. This is a period in which there was a great cultural flourishing in the Byzantine world. For the first time in centuries, the Byzantine world had quite a bit of wealth, and they used it to engage in monumental architecture, paintings, art of all variety, and also a renewed interest and vigor in scholarship. Of all of the Macedonian emperors, no one exemplifies this movement more than Constantine VII. He not only helped to foster further artistic and scholarly achievements, but he also partook himself as a writer. And in addition, he was interested in collecting things, so his work as a collector and patron was also valuable, since it created demand that other writers and creators could benefit from. So if you had to choose one person to be the personification of a movement which took place over about 2 centuries, I think that without a doubt, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus is that person. I would now like to look at some of the major pieces of Constantine's surviving corpus. This is by no means complete. And also, I don't know exactly the order in which he wrote some of these. Some of them can be dated precisely, but others can't. What I've tried to do here is to arrange them as chronologically as I think possible. So I've done a little bit of guesswork, especially with this first one, De Ceremoniis Aulae Byzantinae. This is a complete encyclopedia of ritual protocols for every church feast and state occasion. If you'll recall, Constantine, during his time as emperor under Romanus, so as the understudy emperor, couldn't really make any decisions of state. However, he did attend state functions. This meant that he had plenty of time to observe what would happen, and as an emperor, he had a pretty good library card, so he was able to look up information and figure out what should happen at these occasions. Maybe it was even sort of a petty way for him to exercise power, or maybe at least make himself a little bit of a nuisance to his father-in-law and his brothers-in-law. At any rate, Constantine compiled something that includes a vast array of events down to the last detail. Coronations, baptisms, funerals, promotions to high offices for government and court officials, even games in the hippodrome. And these details include what clothing you have to wear, what responses are to be sung, the acclamations for the army and the people to make, and even the words that the Blues and the Greens, the two leading circus factions, would have to utter before races. And this is a rich resource if we're trying to construct what it was actually like to be present at the Byzantine court. You might take this to mean that Constantine was an officious man who was really obsessed with ceremony, and perhaps he was, but I personally like to think that his interest in this was spurred mostly by his desire to try to get a little bit of petty revenge on the Lecophoni by forcing them to jump through hoops, and also to legitimate himself by standing up as the champion of tradition, since he, as the only actual member of the Macedonian dynasty, was the rightful inheritor of all of the little nuances of ceremony. Constantine actually published his most important works after he came to the throne in 945. In 950 he published a biography of his grandfather Basil I. It might seem like an odd undertaking. However, I think that for Constantine this was both a personal mission and also a clever piece of propaganda designed to give him license to do things in his own time. Allow me to explain. So, Constantine was effectively an intellectual snob. His ability to retain information was something that set him above all of his peers. He was most probably the most learned man of his day. Certainly he had the most access to information, and he was the most prolific writer of his period, at least in terms of people who have survived. So this was what set him apart from Romanus in his own mind. And in his writings he will condemn Romanus as an unlearned fool, someone who is an embarrassment to the throne. However, that then raises an issue. If we look at Constantine's own father, Leo VI, he was a wise man, he was a learned man, so that's fine. But Constantine's grandfather, Basil, was someone from a far lower socioeconomic background than Romanus. Romanus's father had become wealthy at a young age, and then Romanus had grown up with quite a bit of privilege and had gone on to become a strategos of a theme, and then the Drungarius of the entire Byzantine navy. So his qualifications were pretty solid, and if he grew up well off and in the capital, most likely he also received a pretty solid education, despite what Constantine would have us believe. Basil, on the other hand, emerged as a professional wrestler. He was of peasant stock through and through, and he became emperor because he became drinking buddies with Michael III and then murdered him and took over. So clearly there was a problem with Basil's biography if you were trying to justify the greatness of the Macedonian house and yourself by how learned your family supposedly is. This meant that he needed to whitewash the past and portray Basil as much different from and superior than Romanus Lecapenus. So, not surprisingly, the work that he produces is more of a panegyric than any kind of accurate or factual history. In this history, Basil is portrayed as a benevolent protector of the common man, shielding him from tax collectors and eunuch officials. Since Basil was a usurper, and Constantine, for obvious reasons, hated usurpers, he had to come up with a reason why Basil's usurpation was totally cool. And the reason is that Michael III must have been pure, unadulterated evil. So Basil didn't kill Michael in order to satisfy his ambition, but rather to deliver the empire from evil. So why would Constantine portray Basil specifically as a benevolent protector of the common man? Well, simple. Constantine's own policies would be to protect common small farmers from their predatory neighbors, and by portraying Basil as the same, he was setting a historical precedent. One thing that's interesting about ancient and medieval societies is that they always like to have a precedent they could draw upon, so that way it wouldn't look like they were innovating or coming up with something that was unproven or not rooted in the finest traditions of their empire. So this gave Constantine cover, and who was going to dispute scholarship with the greatest scholar of the day, especially when you had such a relatively small scholarly community. And another thing that's interesting is that he condemns eunuch officials as being rapacious. This was a trope in literature. It was throughout both antiquity and the Middle Ages. Yet we know from Constantine's actions that he clearly did not think that eunuchs were a problem. There are at least two eunuchs with whom he entrusted great power, as we'll see when we look at his policies and his governance. As I mentioned above, Constantine had an abiding interest in things which concerned statecraft. So it should come as no surprise that he wrote an entire essay on Byzantium's foreign policy. The original title of this essay was Constantine to his son Romanus, and it was presented to the boy when he turned 14 in the year 952. It was later expanded and renamed as De Administrando Imperio. What this is an extended essay covering all of the various groups near the imperial frontiers, and it includes detailed assessments of Byzantium's strategic situation and also a lot of advice on how to resolve all of the issues that Romanus might face as emperor one day. This is clearly a product of a specific time and place, however, and can hardly be called timeless. The Bulgars, who were the main enemies of Byzantium in Constantine's youth, and who would become that again years after his death, are not emphasized very heavily and have but a modest role to play. However, the Pechenegs, who looked to be the biggest threat at the time, were featured very prominently, and Constantine covers them at length, describing their customs and describing them as people who are best paid off and fobbed off through money. In general, Constantine advises caution with military engagement, and when it comes to diplomacy, he tells his son to grant as little as possible to ambassadors without causing offense. Whenever possible, do not grant state robes unless it's some kind of an emergency. And above all else, always make sure to safeguard the secret of Greek fire. This is something that had saved Byzantium on many occasions, and it was still a trump card that would no doubt come in handy in the future. Constantine was in general opposed to marriage outside of the empire unless it was to a Western emperor. This also reflects his thinking at this time, as he was trying to arrange a marriage match with Otto I, as we'll see. He also said that if any foreign ambassador comes to court and tries to bring up a promise or act of Romanus I in order to get what they want, that Romanus II should simply tell them that his grandfather had been illiterate, illegitimate, and simply had no knowledge of Byzantine tradition or what was right, so therefore any of his acts or promises are inherently worthless. I imagine that this was an awkward piece of advice for Romanus II to read about his own grandfather. It's unclear when he wrote it, but Constantine's De Thematicus would go down as one of his greater works. This was effectively a historical and geographical description of the imperial themes. This work seems to have been compiled and composed by Constantine himself, although there are some people who have argued that this was done by other scholars on Constantine's behalf. At any rate, Constantine did order scholars to put together other works for him. He compiled collections of all available manuals and treatises relating to a plethora of topics to create effectively an encyclopedia. This included everything from knowledge about horses to knowledge of medicine to manuals on warfare or anything you can really imagine. And this reference library that Constantine assembled at this time would continue to be useful for the Byzantine civil service and future emperors for a very long time. So Constantine, through his work as a scholar, actually prepared future emperors, not just his son Romanus II, to govern the empire in a better and more informed manner. So in that regard, he did make some serious contributions to the empire's future well-being. Let's now shift gears and focus on Constantine's political activities. In 944, he was now about 39 or 40 years old, and up to this point he had only conducted some ceremonial duties on behalf of the empire, and he had engaged in scholarly and artistic endeavors, but for the most part he had not been very politically active. Everything would change that year because his father-in-law Romanus I announced that when he died, his son-in-law Constantine VII, and not his two surviving sons, would succeed him on the throne. For Constantine, this must have been welcome news, but it must have also been a disruption in his life, since he was now about 40 years old, and he must have been accustomed to his routine by this point. We'll see also that he's rather slow to act when it comes time to seize power. So maybe he had really come to just accept his fate at this time. His two brothers-in-law, Stephen and Constantine, were now slated to lose their crowns when their father died, and since their father was old and not in the best of health, they resolved to act, and they knew they had to act fast. This would create a crisis, and it would be the first time that Constantine, as an adult, would be in a position to actually act on his own behalf as a fully independent political player. A few days before Christmas, the Lacopani brothers deposed their father and sent him off to a monastery. Constantine at this time had something going for him that he may or may not have realized. Because he was the scion of the Macedonian dynasty, he was popular with the people, and he could not easily be deposed for fear of a public backlash. When the two brothers were trying to find him and take his crown away, they were stopped by the presence of a mob outside the palace gates, threatening to storm the palace unless they saw Constantine was alive and well. Constantine waved to the crowd, they cheered him, and that gave him a degree of safety. This led to an extended standoff between Constantine and his brothers-in-law, where all three of them were ostensibly emperors now that Romanus had left the scene. Constantine was in theory in charge, since he had been named as the primary heir apparent, but the two brothers had gotten rid of their father, and they had some followers, clearly. So this led to a strange, uneventful standoff. Around January 6th or so, Helena grew tired of this family feud, and she convinced her husband Constantine that he should capitalize on his popularity and legitimacy and send her brothers into exile. He finally did so, and now he was fully emperor as of early January 945. Just as a side note, you have no idea how hard it is to find a good picture of a coup using Google Images. This was the best I could come up with. This is Augusto Pinochet, who was dictator in one of the South American countries, Chile, I believe, after a coup. So that is why there's a strange man in what looks like a band uniform on your screen. Romanus I had more or less controlled the Byzantine government in its entirety for 25 years. This meant that there were many men who owed their positions to Romanus and his relatives. So, not surprisingly, the first act of Constantine VII was to try to drain the swamp, as it were, and get rid of anyone who would be more loyal to the Lacopani than they would be to the Macedonian dynasty. While Constantine's own policies as emperor were very similar to Romanus's, he did make some major changes in personnel. One of the most significant moves that he made, and arguably one of the worst moves, was the removal of John Kerkawas from command in the east. He was recalled and replaced in 945. Most likely Constantine feared the combination of Kerkawas having risen to power under Romanus's direction, and also just the general fear that emperors without military glory had of generals who had accrued quite a bit. There had been a certain pattern in earlier Roman history of generals achieving great victories, becoming heroes, and then marching on the capital and seizing power. So it was perhaps a prudent move, but it also meant that Constantine's forces in the east would lose a lot of their momentum with the loss of Kerkawas's generalship. There was also the Parakoimomenos Theophanes. This is basically a chamberlain or something of that nature, and he was still loyal to the old regime. He formed a coup with Patriarch Theophylact, who was another son of Romanus I, and it seems to have been designed to restore the elderly Romanus I to power. By this point, though, Romanus was really far gone, and he was obsessed with the fate of his soul, and probably wasn't even involved. So when Constantine found out about this plot, which doesn't seem to have attracted much support, he didn't take it all that seriously. He did make sure to exile and disgrace Theophanes, but he didn't even bother to remove the patriarch from office, since the coup posed no real threat, and since removing a patriarch would cause a bit of a controversy. So Constantine more or less deftly dealt with what remained of the followers of the Lecophony, and he did so rather effectively, even if it meant losing the services of one of the most talented generals that the Byzantine world had ever seen. Whenever you're purging the government of the supporters of your opponent, it's important to make sure that you replace them with people who are both loyal and capable. For the most part, Constantine was rather successful in that regard. The first person he turned to for help was Bardas Phocas. Bardas was the younger brother of Romanus's old rival Leo Phocas, and apparently Bardas and Constantine had been in contact for a while, with Bardas constantly assuring the beleaguered emperor that he was an ally and that the Phocas clan would always support the Macedonian house and never the Lecophony. Bardas apparently still held it against Romanus that Leo had been executed, and that was something he would never forgive. This meant that Bardas was loyal, and it would be useful to have the Phocas clan satisfied since they were one of the most powerful families in the empire. Accordingly, Constantine decided that Bardas would make a fine commander of the eastern forces. He would, of course, replace Kerkawas, but proved to be far less effective as a general. Bardas Phocas would retire in 957, and then his son Nicephorus would take command. Nicephorus would prove to be far more capable than his father, but that is a different story for a different day for the most part. Another great general would emerge in the east. He would command the more northern front, whereas the Phocas men would be commanding in what is now Cilicia and Syria. John Themistokles would emerge in the more northern theater around Armenia. And of course, he also will play a major role in the future that we won't really get to here. Constantine also entrusted two eunuchs with extraordinary responsibilities, Constantine Gangyles and John Joseph Bringas. Surprisingly, the last of Constantine's associates was another eunuch, but someone from a family you wouldn't think that Constantine would ever turn to. Romanus had a son named Basil who was apparently quite a bit younger than the others, and Constantine had him castrated. Following his castration, presumably years later, Basil would come back and enter into the imperial service under Constantine, or perhaps Romanus II, most likely Constantine, and then he would go on to have a long and fruitful career working for the Macedonian dynasty. So these were the men that Constantine chose, and they would more or less serve him as well as they could. So he chose rather wisely, all things considered. When we looked at Romanus I, we noticed that there was a rising problem of the hoi dunatoi, the powerful, the aristocrats, gobbling up the land of free peasants. As we talked about, what would happen is that every time there was a drought or a famine or some other problem which would cause peasants living in a subsistence agricultural system to face hardship, they would be forced to sell their land in order to make ends meet and feed their families. Aristocrats who had a surplus would then use that as an opportunity to enhance their own holdings. What this did was consolidate the land in fewer and fewer hands. Since the Byzantine thematic system required men to own land in order to support themselves and serve militarily, this was actually a national security threat for the Byzantine world, not to mention a social problem since it created homelessness and other things. So Romanus had tried some rather ineffective laws against that by making it harder to sell land as a peasant, but Constantine would go further. In 947, he passed a law demanding an immediate restitution without compensation of all peasant lands that had been bought up during his reign. It's not clear if he meant from 945 or from 913. He could have claimed both just as easily. He was especially concerned with the land holdings of soldiers and sailors, because as I mentioned, these were supposed to support those men with income. However, there had been a practice that what these men would do is sell off all but a little bit of their land, and then they would be left with an insufficient amount to live off the income and focus on their military service. So in order to make sure that this was not a problem and that his soldiers could focus on their duties, Constantine laid down a principle that land must be worth a specified amount of gold. So now soldiers and sailors were unable to sell off their land, and they had to maintain a certain financial standing. Apparently, it would appear that Constantine was assisting them in retaining that standing, although it's not exactly clear how, or exactly how hands-on Constantine's approach was when it came to enforcing this law. Land laws were pretty hard to enforce with a small medieval government. For the most part, Constantine VII did not embark on any major campaigns. If you'll recall, he strictly advised his son Romanus against any kind of major military actions if avoidable. However, perhaps he learned that lesson the hard way. As we mentioned, he wrote his treatise to his son in 952, but in 949 he actually decided to embark on a grand campaign against the Emirate of Crete. The Emirate of Crete had more or less been a pirate kingdom in the middle of the Aegean Sea, which allowed its Arab raiders to sally forth and cause havoc along the Byzantine coastlines of Asia Minor and Greece. So taking out Crete would really enhance Byzantine security and would lead to increased trade and prosperity. To accomplish this goal, Constantine decided to form a grand international coalition and work with fellow monarchs to achieve this. He tried to work with both Otto I and the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba, but neither of these rulers provided material assistance. It's unclear if they promised that they would, but maybe the failure of the Byzantine expedition would make sense if it was just that they were counting on this support, and when it didn't materialize, they then found themselves insufficiently manned. At any rate, the expedition eventually landed in Crete, Byzantine only, under the command of the eunuch Constantine Gangyles. As they marched inland, they were taken by surprise, and they were routed entirely. Our sources predictably blame the inexperience and incompetence of the eunuch commander, but most likely it was due to the fact that any war for Crete is going to be a rough fight. Crete has some rugged terrain, and it is not an easy place to invade unless you have overwhelming force. So while Constantine Gangyles' generalship probably played a role, it was not the only factor, and as I've noted on many occasions, anytime someone who fails as a eunuch, the sources are way rougher on that person, and we have to be weary of the sources just simply being biased against eunuchs. On the Eastern Front, the removal of John Kerkawas in favor of Bardas Phocas proved to be temporarily disastrous. Saif al-Dawla was able to recover from the thrashing that he had taken at the hands of Kerkawas, and he was able to rebuild the Emirate of Aleppo. Bardas then found himself unable to make headway against the wily emir. In 954, Bardas was badly injured in a battle, presumably a defeat, and his son Nicephorus temporarily assumed command. At some point around that time, John Zimisces also took up command to the north of where the Phocas family was in command. In 957, Nicephorus would finally take command for real, and his father would retire. That same year, Nicephorus was able to capture the city of Adatta in Pamphylia, and thereby gain control of one of the major mountain passes through the Taurus Mountains, something that would give the Byzantines easier access to Syria, an area they were beginning to raid and expand into. Meanwhile, the next year, Zemskis was able to take Samosata on the Euphrates River, another major victory. So by the end of his reign, Constantine's generals were once again making progress, but for most of his reign they were stagnated. Had, say, his predecessor Romanus persisted longer and kept Kerkawas in command, the Byzantines would have actually been better off on this front. So Constantine's reign, while it ended up fine, could have been better when it came to what happened on the eastern frontier. Interestingly enough, the Balkans were quiet during almost the entirety of Constantine's reign. Bulgaria was still under the peaceable Peter I throughout the entirety of Constantine's reign, and that probably accounts for why the Balkans were quiet. However, in Italy, quite a bit of stuff happened. The Byzantine position for the most part continued to weaken as it was exposed to many challengers. The Magyars occupied some of northern Italy. Local aristocrats took control of Rome and the papacy, which reduced the prestige of the papacy to unforeseen low levels. Muslim pirates from Sicily and North Africa were able to raid the coastal cities of Italy, including the cities of Byzantine southern Italy. The future Western Holy Roman Emperor Otto I began to gain power in Italy, and Constantine VII immediately and early recognized his potential and tried to court his favor. As we saw earlier with Constantine's effort to build a coalition to go to Crete, he was a ruler who was greatly interested in using diplomacy to achieve his ends. He was not a conqueror, he was someone who saw himself as a person with a broader bag of tools to accomplish his goals. We know that one of his tricks was to use grandeur to his advantage. Liutprand of Cremona visited the court and marveled at the wonders that Constantine erected for the benefit of his visitors. Constantine, or some of his engineers, managed to make a moving throne and mechanical animals who made noises in the throne room. So effectively he turned the court into a Chuck E. Cheese. These were the main things that Constantine used to awe his visitors, and the effect was quite profound on the men who visited from other princes. Certainly Liutprand of Cremona was someone who didn't have the easiest personality, but he loved Constantine and thought that his court was quite impressive. And fortunately for us, Constantine's diplomatic endeavors are fairly well documented, so we can get a good idea of what he was trying to accomplish internationally. Here are a few of the negotiations that we know that Constantine overtook while he was on the throne. In 946, Constantine and Saif al-Dawla agreed to exchange prisoners. By this point, Saif had captured some Byzantines, and the Byzantines had long held many of Saif's men, so they both gained from this arrangement. In 949 alone, the year of the Cretan expedition, we know of at least 3 embassies that Constantine was involved with. He was simultaneously talking with the Caliphate of Cordoba, Otto I of what was then called East Francia, and envoys to the Magyars requesting a non-aggression pact and offering baptism to their leaders. In 957, Igor's widow and regent, Princess Olga, visited on a mission of peace, and after many audiences, she agreed to become a Christian, and she received baptism in the Hagia Sophia, sponsored by Empress Helena. Decades later, her grandson Vladimir would grow up as a Christian, and his conversion would impact the future of Russia pretty dramatically. So this was a negotiation late in Constantine's reign that would end up having a profound long-term impact. In 956, Constantine was finally relieved of the burden of having Theophylact as his patriarch. Theophylact had been his brother-in-law and also a would-be conspirator against his throne, so it is doubtful that Constantine shed many tears at his funeral. Now Constantine had a choice to make when it came to appointing Theophylact's successor. and for whatever reason he chose a man named Polyeuctus. Exactly what he was hoping to get out of Polyeuctus is unclear, but Polyeuctus would soon prove to be a bit of a pain in the ass vis-a-vis Constantine. Polyeuctus resurrected the issue of Constantine's birth because he was an adamant opponent of remarriage. He also insisted on restoring the positive memory of Patriarch Euthemius, who had been the chief opponent of Leo VI's fourth marriage. So this must have all been very grating to Constantine, since this was a personal insult. And also having Polyeuctus challenge him on matters of theology and canon law would have no doubt deeply annoyed Constantine, who, with great reason, thought of himself as the smartest and wisest man of his time. So this was sort of a self-inflicted wound, but Polyeuctus would go on to play a major role in the struggles for the throne in the 960s, and he would be just as hard on all future emperors as he had been on Constantine VII. So at least Polyeuctus was consistent, even if in Constantine's eyes he must have been a bit of a pest. Early in his life, Constantine had arranged for Romanus II to marry someone, but unfortunately she had died as a child and they had never consummated their marriage. In 958, Romanus was now about 20, and he was still single, so Constantine was looking for a daughter-in-law. He was really interested in marrying into the family of Otto I, but Romanus wouldn't hear of it and instead chose to marry a beautiful peasant girl from the Peloponnese named Theophano. Constantine may or may not have liked her, but at any rate he accepted his son's choice. When Constantine died in November of 959, there were rumors that Theophano had poisoned him. Most likely these rumors date from a later time when Theophano had gained some notoriety for her activities. And also another trope in Byzantine literature is that anytime you have a woman who has any kind of sexual desire, she is inherently evil, and Theophano clearly did like men, so she must have had something wrong with her, and therefore she was capable of murdering Constantine, I suppose, by extension. Most likely she had nothing to do with his death. As we mentioned, he was overweight and sedentary, and also by this point he was well into middle age, so something like a heart attack or something along those lines was by no means unlikely, and I don't think that we need to suspect foul play. Constantine died at the height of his power. He had published quite a bit of literature, and he had his family set up for the future. His son Romanus II was 21 years old, still young, but old enough to rule in his own right, and he had been well prepared. Much better prepared than most of the emperors who would come to the throne, at least. And Romanus already had an heir apparent thanks to Theophano. He had an infant son named Basil. This Basil would of course grow up to become Basil II the Bulgar Slayer in later years. So Constantine died, having fended off the attempt at usurpation by Romanus Lecapenus, and in that sense he had succeeded in keeping the Macedonian dynasty going. But was he actually a successful emperor? Surprisingly, there was quite a bit of variance among the sources of the time as to whether or not Constantine VII was a good emperor. Today, if you were to read a brief survey of Byzantine history, you would get the impression that Constantine VII was very clearly one of the greats. However, the sources from the Middle Ages have a more mixed review. And in fact, of our three sources, two of them are negative. John Skylitzes, the source for both Cadrinus and Zanaris, paints Constantine as borderline disastrous. They say that he was way too hands-off, he was too bookish and uninvolved, and that he did not pay sufficient attention to government, made bad appointments, etc. Most likely by bad appointments they mean that he entrusted power to eunuchs, which, as I've mentioned, that is a huge source bias. They assume that eunuchs are corrupt. And another reason why aristocratic authors absolutely hate eunuchs is that in their view eunuchs take jobs and power away from aristocrats. If you have a eunuch serving as chamberlain, for instance, or commanding an army, that is a role deprived for an aristocrat. They wanted those jobs and they wanted that power. They wanted that access to the emperor. For his part, an emperor wants to keep the aristocratic houses at bay, and one way to do that is by employing eunuchs. So you can see how that would cause them to paint Constantine in a negative light. Joseph Bringos was more or less entrusted with the entire domestic operation of the empire by the end of Constantine's reign. He was both the chamberlain and the head of the bureaucracy. So, in that sense, if you hold a strong bias against eunuchs, you would see Constantine as not a great emperor. On the other hand, Theophanes the Continuator, this is an anonymous person who continued the work of Theophanes, says that Constantine, by contrast, was a hardworking administrator, someone who immediately investigated all cases of injustice against the poor, and took the time to personally review sentences of long-term prisoners. He also says that Constantine always made wise appointments. Theophanes the Continuator may have actually been a little too kind to Constantine. As we've seen of his known appointments, most of them were fine, but it can hardly be said that the sacking of John Kerkawas was without some negative consequences. So for the most part, I think that scholars have rightly taken up the cause of Theophanes the Continuator over that of Cadrinus and Zenaris, but I think that Constantine really isn't the greatest emperor, even if he was one of the better ones. Let us now conclude with my thoughts on Constantine's legacy and significance. One of the things that militates against Constantine's claim to greatness is that he didn't have any signal successes. There was no one great moment which really made Constantine stand out from the pack. However, he seems to have administered the empire competently, and his land laws were a hallmark of Macedonian dynasty policy, as they really helped to shore up the position of the peasantry, and especially that of the common soldier. So that would really help out all of his successors. In addition, his scholarly activity makes him stand out from the pack. His work not only enlightens us about his time, but also served to make the job of the people who are running the empire easier by providing them with easy access to information. So because of the collections of information he put together, he ensured that his successors would be able to run the empire in a more informed fashion. Unlike many emperors, Constantine spent a great deal of time and effort to make sure that his heir was well trained and that he was surrounded by effective and loyal officials. Under Romanus, his generals, such as John Zimisces, Nicephorus Phocas, and Nicephorus's younger brother Leo, would achieve greater deeds than they had under Constantine himself, so those appointments would prove to be wise. And even if he doesn't quite stack up to what his grandson achieved, Constantine VII is still one of the leading lights of the Macedonian dynasty. This was a dynasty that produced a lot of great emperors, and Constantine VII deserves mention as one of them, even if he's not quite as great as a few of the others. In 959, Constantine VII passed away. However, few observers in Constantinople would have been seriously worried about the fate of the empire. Things were going well, both internally and externally, and his son and heir, Romanus II, seemed as well prepared as any new, full Byzantine emperor. His father, Constantine VII, had spent quite a bit of time educating the young man in the art of governance. At 21 years old, Romanus was a full adult who could rule in his own right without having to rely upon a regent, a luxury that many of his ancestors, including his own father, had not enjoyed. He already had a male heir, a baby named Basil. So it was unlikely that Romanus would face the kind of difficulties that Leo VI, his grandfather, had faced in siring an heir. As a young, vigorous, charming, and seemingly healthy man, Romanus II could look forward to decades of rule during which he would prosper, the empire would do well, and he could go down as one of the more successful emperors in Byzantine history. There was no reason why this was in any way delusional or unrealistic. Yet it wasn't to be. Living only 4 years on the throne, Romanus would pass away and subject his own children to a fate similar to the childhood of his father, Constantine VII. And because of that, Romanus enjoys an odd distinction. Most placeholder rulers are purposely put there to be older men who can guide and fill time while younger men step up into a role. A placeholder is typically someone like the Emperor Nerva, who was just there as a compromise candidate until a more suitable replacement could be found. Romanus was intended to be the suitable replacement and rule for decades, but that's not how his life turned out. So in this video, what I want to do is explore what he did accomplish in his 4 years, try to explain why he actually is important even if he is not personally all that interesting, and also look at how his premature death had a massive impact on the course of the next few decades. Romanus II had a unique childhood, and at a young age he was exposed to many people holding the title of emperor, all of whom were related to him, but most of whom were hostile to one another. Luckily, of course, that never broke out in a full-scale civil war, so Romanus II was never in danger of losing his life due to the internecine struggles of his family. His grandfather and namesake was Romanus I Lecapenus. The older Romanus would have been alive for the first 10 or so years of his grandson's life, and I'm sure that they must have met, although it's unlikely that they were terribly close, given that Romanus II was the son of Constantine VII, someone whom Romanus I had a difficult relationship with, and since Romanus I had become very depressive in his later years, someone who was often contemplating his own death and the fate of his immortal soul, so he did not be the kind of personality that a child would gravitate toward. The father of Romanus II was, of course, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, and I think it's safe to say that Constantine was the biggest influence in his son's early life. Born in the year 938, Romanus II would be 7 years old when his father would finally expel his uncles from the throne and take full power in early 945. That same year, Constantine had his son crowned, and Romanus would be officially his heir and his co-emperor. In 959, the next time we really hear about Romanus, he is now 21 years old, and by all accounts, he is well prepared to rule. His father has been grooming him the entire time. His father also, as we noted in a previous video, wrote a number of works on government, and many of them address Romanus II directly and instruct him on how to properly run the empire and how things like court ritual are to be conducted properly. As we'll see, one of the accusations against Romanus II is that he was not very hardworking and that he did not take his duties as emperor seriously enough. Why would that be? Here, what I'd like to do is kind of just speculate as to why Romanus II may have had a little bit of indifference to his duties as emperor. And while many writers have simply just said, well, he was a young man and he liked to party, I think it might be a little darker than that, and it boils down to something like daddy issues, but on a deeper level. If we read Constantine VII's writings addressed to Romanus, we find that Constantine pulls no punches when it comes to talking about Romanus's grandfather and namesake, effectively calling the man a complete moron who was uncultured and boorish. The problem here is that as the namesake of Romanus I, and as someone who owed half of his genetic material to the Lecapeni, it would be hard for Romanus II to reconcile being a member of the Macedonian dynasty with having a tainted bloodline that owes a lot to this outside group that his father regards as trash. In other words, Romanus II would look at himself in the mirror after reading such a thing and perhaps think, I'm only half what my father was. I am tainted in some way. Maybe he simply didn't feel sufficiently worthy of this power, and he tried to put a little bit of distance between himself and the throne. And we also don't really know the full extent of Romanus's relationship with either his father or with his mother's family. It's possible that he was caught in the middle, that he had feelings for both, but he was basically torn and forced to side with his father, since his father was the man in charge for most of his childhood, at least after he was old enough to understand the problem. We don't know if he had much of a relationship with his uncle Theophylact. He would have been the only other member of the Lycopene family to be around at the time. And of course, he died in 956 when Romanus was still a teenager in his late teens. So anyway, this is speculative. There's no way to really know the psychological motivations of people from the distant past, but it's just something to think about. And I think that this makes a little more sense than something like, oh, he was just young and irresponsible. Due to Romanus's more hands-off approach to government, he was quite dependent on his senior advisors, and they seem to have enjoyed a great deal of latitude when it came to making and enacting policy for the state. Domestic affairs remained entrusted to Joseph Bringas, who combined being the chief minister with being Drungarius or admiral-in-chief. Bringas was a eunuch, and he was a favorite of Constantine VII, who actually created his position which combined those two competencies. Bringas, of course, as a eunuch, was reviled in our sources and portrayed as someone who was brilliant but evil. If you are a eunuch in the ancient or medieval world and you exercise power, then the aristocrats who write histories look at you in a negative light and think that you are untrustworthy and that you are trying to undermine all that is good in the world. That is a very common bias, and I don't think we have to take it too seriously. Basil was another senior advisor. He served as president of the Senate, so his job was more or less corralling other elites to follow Romanus's lead. In the east, Nicephorus Phocas remained as the primary field commander for the Byzantine armies in the area. The primary threat there was still Emir Saif al-Dawla. Patriarch Polyeucus also remained in power. He had come to power in 956, and he had distinguished himself under Constantine VII. However, most of his other known actions come after the death of Romanus II, so he won't really feature in our story here today, but it's almost certain that he remained a highly influential figure in the city, and that he must have had some influence here and there, although we don't have any direct attestation of what he was trying to do. The young emperor was described as being quite a bit like his father in terms of his physical appearance and personality. He shared his father's stocky build, but he did add some of his mother's beauty and grace. So he was better looking than his father had been, but still fairly similar looking. Romanus's critics said that he was too frivolous and spent way too much of his time hunting. That was not an uncommon fault for aristocratic young men or for royal young men, but this was something that was not an appealing trait in an emperor, since hunting could be dangerous and it hardly kept the tax money coming into the capital. Since Romanus's reign, however, took place in his early 20s, one could argue that he simply didn't get the chance to grow up and fulfill his role. And since he had so many capable ministers around him, he didn't really need to do all that much. Perhaps his thought was that he would let these ministers serve out their careers, and when they were done, he would step it up. Again, we simply don't know, but because we have no direct evidence of him being incapable or incompetent in any way, I don't think that there's any reason to just think that he was a silly person who only cared about spearing boars. Since he was associated with his father on the throne from a young age, Romanus II had actually been married while he was still a boy. He had married Bertha, a daughter of Hugh of Arles, but she had died shortly after their wedding before the match had been consummated. In 958, Romanus rejected his father's choice of a second wife, Hedwig of Bavaria, a niece of the Emperor Otto. Instead of marrying a foreign princess or the daughter of a noble house, that same year in 958, Romanus II selected for himself the daughter of a Peloponnesian innkeeper named Theophano. How he met her, we do not know. Leo the Deacon, however, says that Theophano was the most beautiful woman of her time and was truly stunning. Perhaps rumors of her beauty had wafted up to Constantinople. Young Romanus heard about them, and he decided to investigate for himself, liked what he saw, and told his father that this will be my bride. As the daughter of an innkeeper, Theophano was not a well-educated woman, but she still had quite a bit of ambition, and she was clearly pretty capable in a lot of ways. In other words, she was not an empty gown, and she was not Megan Fox. She was only 18 when she joined her husband at the palace, but she would quickly establish her dominance at court. A year after she came to Constantinople, her father-in-law Constantine VII died. Later manuscripts accuse her of poisoning Constantine VII, but there is no evidence that this is actually the case. It's simply a reflection of the typical prejudice against women who were a little more on the loose side, and because Theophano took at least one lover out of wedlock at a later time, she is seen in a negative light, and then all kinds of over-the-top accusations are leveled against her. She was intensely ambitious and ruthless, as I said, and after Constantine was dead, Theophano really advanced her own authority as the new empress. She wanted to eliminate all of her female rivals, and in this case what that meant were the women of the Macedonian dynasty who were blood relatives of her husband. She had all 5 of Romanus's sisters cloistered, so none of them could be used for diplomatic purposes and none of them could challenge her authority. We have reason to believe that these sisters were relatively close with Romanus and that Theophano was simply jealous of them. As for Romanus's mother, the Empress Dowager Helena, she was relegated to a distant corner of the palace, where she died quietly in September of 961. It's possible that because Helena's influence was cut so dramatically that she was largely neglected, and that her death was one that was rather quiet and not seen as a big deal, which is kind of sad. Helena had, of course, been the daughter of Romanus I, and then she had been the one who convinced Constantine VII to challenge her brothers and establish his rule. So she had been an important woman in Byzantine history, but her death would be a very quiet one, where she would be deprived of the company of her daughters. Was Theophano truly evil, or was she just cunning? It's hard to say, but she clearly was not a saint. While we don't know enough about Romanus II to know exactly what he wanted to do as emperor, it is pretty obvious that he was the primary architect of the Cretan expedition of 960. He was determined to undo his father's failure from 949 and finally crush the Emirate of Crete. Crete had become a pirate haven and had been so for quite a long time. It was a thorn in the side of the Byzantine Aegean, and conquering it would be a great deed. It would be one way, at least, for him to surpass his father and join the ranks of the important emperors. Within just a few weeks of assuming power, just as his father's corpse was finally going cold, Romanus II started organizing this expedition, directing immense resources to the project, with perhaps around 50,000 total men being involved in this operation. To head this expedition, he chose his most capable and important general, Nicephorus Phocas, who vacated his command in the east in order to carry out this mission in Crete. Despite many difficulties, the expedition ultimately succeeded, and when it did, this led to an all-night Thanksgiving. When he returned to Constantinople, Phocas was greeted by the emperor and then given an ovation in the Hippodrome. People have argued that Nicephorus Phocas deserved a triumph, but it would appear that Romanus wanted to take the primary credit for the expedition himself, and also he didn't want to load down Nicephorus with too many honors, since that might make him a rival. So while people do talk about Romanus II being a little too hands-off, there is often evidence that he had a brain and that he was thinking ahead and thinking critically. The absence of Nicephorus and some of the forces from the east could have presented a problem. However, Nicephorus had a brother named Leo, and his brother was able to take command and fill his shoes fairly adequately. The main threat in the east was still Emir Saif al-Dawla, and he was emboldened by the absence of Nicephorus and the weakening of the Eastern Army. In early 960, Saif struck a fortress near Melitene, massacring a garrison and taking away many prisoners. This area had been conquered fairly recently during the reign of Romanus I, and I imagine for Saif this was still a sore spot. Leo, rather than fighting Saif head-on, since he was at a numerical disadvantage, instead got behind Saif and set up an ambush in the Taurus mountain passes that Saif would have to pass through. Being burdened down by luggage and plunder, Saif marched through the mountains in a way that was not prepared to receive an ambush. When Leo sprung the trap, Saif and his men fought hard, and they managed to acquit themselves well, but ultimately they were unsuccessful, and the entire force was almost massacred. Saif himself did manage to escape, however, with 300 of his best horsemen. The only way that he fully got away, however, and avoided his pursuers was by dropping gold coins behind him so that his pursuers would stop to enhance their personal wealth. Saif's power was greatly diminished after this defeat, and Leo had set up the Byzantine armies of the future for great successes by breaking the back of Byzantium's greatest enemy during this period. By early 962, Nicephorus Phocas had returned to the east and resumed command over the eastern forces. His brother Leo seems to have been sent to the Balkans for whatever reason during this time, so Nicephorus would be on his own. However, things were going great. The Byzantine army was recently successful in 2 major campaigns, morale was sky high, and with that heavy defeat on Saif's army, the enemy was on the run. Nicephorus decided to campaign in the region of Cilicia, and there he was able to take 55 or so walled towns between February and March of 962. This would have given him effective control of almost the entire region, and it would have given him control of probably the Taurus passes, meaning that he could now enter into Syria whenever he pleased, while also being able to block enemy forces from going from Syria into Asia Minor. So this was a major campaign that often gets overlooked because it doesn't feature any real battles or much drama. Pausing to celebrate Easter, Nicephorus then began to prepare for an invasion of Syria and an attack on Saif al-Dawla's capital at Aleppo. When Nicephorus Phocas crossed the Taurus Mountains and entered Syria, Said knew that he needed to slow down this Byzantine advance, so he sent one of his generals to intercept Nicephorus, but somehow that army was unable to intercept the Byzantine force, and the 2 armies never met in battle. Nicephorus should not have been that hard to find, however, since he was actively laying waste to the Syrian countryside as he approached Aleppo. His goal, of course, being to deprive the city of supplies so that they would be forced to surrender more quickly. Somehow, he managed to arrive in a way that was not all that anticipated. At any rate, Saif managed to set up an emergency army, a sort of B team, if you will, to try to defend the city. And he challenged Nicephorus, but was quickly and easily defeated. Saif seems to have been at the head of this army, and when it was defeated, he was then unable to get back to the city to rally the defenders in time, so he was forced to flee. One of his primary palaces, the palace of Al-Halaba, was located outside of the city and was quickly taken because it was completely indefensible without a strong army. This palace had 18 years or so worth of plunder that Saif had accumulated, and it yielded 390,000 silver dinars, thousands of animals such as camels and horses, and treasure of all kinds. Without Saif present, the garrison lost heart and didn't have much will to fight, so they surrendered the city on December 23rd of 962, but there were some loyalists to Saif who managed to hold on to the citadel. So this area, while it was in theory conquered, was not really annexed, and the Byzantines would have to come back later and complete the conquest of Aleppo. For the most part, the Balkans were fairly quiet during Romanus II's reign, but there was one major incident in 962. A major Magyar threat materialized. We don't really know too many details about it, but we do know that there was a Magyar invasion of Byzantine territory, and that Byzantine forces under Leo Phocas and Marianos Argyros were able to repel this invasion that year. Victories such as this one enabled continued recovery and prosperity in the Byzantine Balkans, something that the area needed after the depredations of Simeon in previous decades. In March 963, after he returned from a lengthy hunting expedition, Romanus suddenly fell ill and died unexpectedly. At this time, when he died, his general Nicephorus Phocas had returned back to Cappadocia, and so was not all that far from the capital, a fact which will be significant when we talk about the next emperor. Theophano was accused of poisoning her husband by later sources, but that would have been an incredibly stupid move, and that would have seriously endangered her position, so it's unlikely. Romanus, at the time of his death, left behind 3 children: Basil, who had been born in 958, Constantine, who was born in 960, and Anna, who was born in 963. It's not really clear whether that was before or after her father's death, but nonetheless, he died, leaving behind 3 children and a widow. Since his eldest son and heir Basil would have only been 5 years old at the time, this was clearly a precarious position, and in many ways this is really when Theophano's career will truly begin. But that's a different story for a different day. Romanus didn't live to see it, and neither will we in this video. While, due to the brevity of his reign and the far more interesting and important emperors who preceded and succeeded him, it is impossible to regard Romanus II as anything other than a placeholder, he still managed to preside over a pair of highly important victories. While these victories were achieved by Nicephorus Phocas, they were authorized by Romanus II, so he deserves quite a bit of credit. First of all, he managed to preside over the defeat of Byzantium's most inveterate enemy at this time, Saif al-Dawla. While Saif would linger for another 5 years or so after his defeat in 962, he was a broken man, and his health was also more or less shattered by this defeat, or at least by this time. Maybe it was more natural, but maybe it was this defeat which really put him on the downslope. At any rate, Romanus was the one who pushed for the conquest of Crete, something that was a major undertaking and had been something of a bear trap for previous emperors. By putting in a maximum effort, Romanus ensured that this would come to fruition, and this would have some important consequences for the Byzantine world. Both of these victories set the stage for large-scale colonization, expansion, and economic growth in subsequent years, which allowed for the resettlement of some abandoned or sparsely populated coastal areas. Of the two achievements, I would have to rank the conquest of Crete higher, simply because it effectively ended Arab piracy in the Aegean and really allowed for Byzantine coastal areas there to flourish. This would become once again part of the heartland of Byzantine power, and of course that would really help all of Romanus's successors. Oh, and his son Basil grew up to become Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. I think that's a fairly important part of his legacy. So At any rate, that is all there is to say about Romanus II, at least from me. Next time we will talk about the man who married his mother and became the new emperor. If you were paying attention to this video, you probably already guessed who that person is.